Hey, this is Daniel Arthur Smith.
Hi, this is Krista Walsh.
This is Justin Sloan.
Hey guys, this is Ernie Howard. You're listening to 30 Minute
Author Interviews with my friend Preston
Lay.
Woohoo!
Hey everybody, we've got a great episode for you today. But first I want to tell you about two of our sponsors. First up is Serial Box. Serial Box delivers exciting episodes of ongoing stories straight to your device every Wednesday. They bring everything that's awesome about TV to what's already cool about books with addicting serials you can take with you on the go. All of their episodes are available in text and audio, and their sleek app makes reading easier than ever. They have a range of titles from gritty urban thrillers to sexy sword-fighting fantasies and everything in between. Season 2 of The Witch Who Came In From the Cold just started up. The Witch Who Came In From the Cold. All the subterfuge of the Americans with a dark dose of magic. Head on over to serialbox.com where you can read and listen to it now. And of course, the first episode of Season 1 is free, so you can check it out there. Serialbox.com, serialbox.com. Our second sponsor this week is the Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. A thirst for revenge sends one man on a deadly journey through the galaxy in this adrenaline-pumping new series. Asher is a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. In a desire to better understand humans in order to destroy them, these aliens are projecting their consciousness into unsuspecting men and women, and in the process are learning exactly how to use humanity's own selfishness and greed as weapons against them. Fueled by emotions that the aliens will never understand, Asher bands together with a group of friends. These four MIT co-eds are more than meets the eye and go to battle with those who are intent on destroying our planet. Asher takes the fight from Earth to an alien spaceship and then to the very planet of the enemy trying to destroy them. Galactic Satori Chronicles can be found on Amazon, where Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are only 99 cents. Welcome everybody to this episode of 30-Minute Author Interviews. Our guest this week is military sci-fi author S.F. Edwards. Thank you for stopping by and doing 30-Minute Author Interviews. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Well, we start out each episode here with a segment that we call Two Truths and a Lie, where you tell me two truths and a lie about yourself, and I try to get it right. It hasn't been very successful on my part, but do you have two truths and a lie about yourself?
I do. I used to work back in college, back at the Aviation Challenge program, which is an offshoot of Space Camp. I built my own home previous to this one, and I have been on all but two of the U.S. aircraft carriers, including the LHAs and LHDs.
Okay, so they all they all sound very reasonable. Man, I don't know too much about you besides what you see on your bio and stuff. So for that reason alone, I'm going to go with building your own house is the lie.
That is correct. That is the goal, but I have not yet gotten to the point of building my own house.
Oh, awesome. Can you kind of tell us any cool story with you working at the offshoot of the space camp when you were right out of college?
Actually, it was while I was in college. I worked there for 4 summers in college, and I met some of my very best friends to this day working there, including a friend who was also an author, and I made some very good connections with folks in the military, in aviation industry, including some real characters who may or may not make cameos into my books.
There we go. That's funny. Where was this camp at?
It's in Huntsville, Alabama. It's actually about
really?
It's 3/4 of a mile down the road from space camp itself.
I know exactly where that is. My grandparents live in Huntsville, and so that whole space area was, man, probably about 10 minutes from their house. So we would drive by there every time, and I always love. I've only been in there once or twice, but I always love seeing the SR-71 sitting out front. I've got my picture with it. Such a cool plane, but that's such a cool place. I love that place.
Technically, that's an A-12, but yes,
is it? Hey, that's all right.
I was working there when they put up the full-scale Saturn V standing rocket, and that was an interesting project to watch go up. There's a whole lot of drama behind that thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their original plan was to stand up the actual Saturn V they have in the back.
Okay.
That they kind of stole from NASA.
Okay.
It was on a loan on display there, and the Space and Rocket Center being run by, at the time, basically being run by von Braun, decided they wanted to keep it. NASA wasn't thrilled with, was saying, no, we're just loaning this. We're going to take it around the country and show it off. They planted trees around it. So that by the time NASA said, okay, your time to have this is over, they came back and they couldn't get it out. So
that's funny.
NASA basically said, if you're going to stand it up, that means you're going to cut down the trees. We want it back. So Space and Rocket Center said, nope, we're just going to build one.
Right. Wow.
And it's crooked. The model is crooked. They kind of messed up the top end of it. They may have fixed it by now. But there was a huge grand plan for that thing. They were gonna have a whole launch gantry too, with a hotel and a restaurant at the top, and I think they were being a little too ambitious at the time.
Okay, so, right. Okay, yeah.
But it was neat to see it going up over that summer. So
yeah, that's neat. That's cool that you. I don't know if I've ever talked to anybody that actually used to work out there, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it was very cool because once it went up, you could actually see it from the Aviation Challenge facility. You could see the top of it poking up through the trees. So that kind of gave everybody a good reference of how far away we were from each other.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, for my listeners that might not know who you are or what you do, can you kind of tell our listeners who you are and what you do?
I am SF Edwards. I am the writer-creator of the Spiral Wars series, which is a planned 10-book military sci-fi space opera series. I am also an aerospace engineer, father of 3 boys plus 2 stepsons, and creator of all kinds of stuff I like to build, which includes basically designing pretty much everything that appears, because I am an engineer, designing pretty much everything that appears in the books. And I've recently actually gotten into modifying Nerf guns and making those into the weapons in the books.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I've got one project that's almost done. It'll make its premiere at a Nerf war in 2 weeks. So I have some friends who are very interested in seeing that thing once it's done.
You said Nerf war? What's I've never heard of that before. What's Nerf war?
It's something it's something I only gotten into recently, where basically it's folks get together with their Nerf guns and battle it out. They team up, or free for all, and just they go at it with each other. I started into it from the costuming perspective from my oldest son. He was doing a costume. He needed a gun. We found an old Nerf gun at a Goodwill, painted it up, and there was his blaster. And then, we started playing with it and playing with a couple of others, saying, God, these things are fun. It's been so long since we, messed with these. And we started collecting them and modifying them and turning them into props and just loving the heck out of them. We have a giant rack full of them now, to the point where I'm like, I need to, trim this down a little bit. It's taken over the living room. So with a bunch of boys, it works.
Right. So what kind of modifications do you make to these Nerf guns?
Various things. You do spring modifications, replace springs. If you're talking performance, you're talking spring replacement, motor replacements, fixing the air seals. in my case, I do a lot of cosmetic modifications to make them look like the guns in the books. For instance, the one that my best mod to date is based off the main battle rifle that the characters use, laser mass driver combination. So it's 2 barrels. One fires a plasma laser, one fires a kinetic round, and it's painted up. It's got the twin barrels, but I'm going to do a new version of that because right now the 1 barrel doesn't work, and the modification will be I'll get both barrels working. Then the another one I'm just about finished with is a newer model of the main battle rifle. And actually, it's one that's the characters are just using at this point. So I don't want to give too much away because that one doesn't show up until later in the books.
Oh, okay, there we go. So there's this cover designer named Tom Edwards. I don't know if you've heard of him. He does a lot of he's done a lot of very popular space and military space covers. And he does I heard on an interview with Keystroke Medium that he actually has a 3D version of every spaceship. I think it's on the computer that he designed so he can see it in 3D. So it sounds like, do you kind of do that with everything in your books as well?
I do, especially with the ships and the vehicles. I mean, some of the models are kind of old; they need to be updated, and I do that on a kind of cyclical basis. I'll sit there and go, I'm going to redesign this. I'm going to redesign this for whatever reason. But also now on the Spiral War webpage, there is the technical database that has pretty much all the fighters in it right now, all but 1 or 2 of the bombers, and I will start cycling the capital ships as I have time.
That's very neat. So we've been sitting here talking briefly a little bit about your Spiral War series, which was recently, I believe it was near the end of last year, got picked up by Space Doc to produce that. Can you tell our listeners kind of the book blurb on what the Spiral War novel series is about?
The Spiral War novel series, as I said, it's a planned 10-book series. It is a future war that's going on about 200 years by the point that the characters come in, set 500 years in the future. And the main group of characters are Special Operations Force operatives that are, in the first few books, that are in training to become a rescue team. And along the way, it follows them through training through to the eventual end of the war, and how their lives are affected and how their lives are changed as they are fighting their way through this. And as they discover more of what's actually behind the war, maybe the war isn't as straightforward as they thought it was. And there's players in the background that are manipulating things.
Had you already started writing this series when it got picked up by Space Doc?
Actually, yes. By the time I got picked up by Space Doc, I had book 3 written, and it had gone through my own edit and an edit through somebody I knew. And when they picked me up, I was actually getting ready to publish book 3 independently when they picked me up. And we retracted the first 2 books, and now they went through, re-edited, redid the cover artwork, and are putting it back out. I actually have through book 4 finished. I've just started a rewrite of book 5 because the original version no longer holds up for various reasons, right. Mostly because of changes that happened in rewriting books 1 through 4. And once that's done, I have the remainder of the series full, at least basically outlined.
Okay.
So it's ready to go. So hopefully I'll be finishing as I get more time on my hands. Again, the kids are older. I'll be able to write the rest of the series a little faster and get it ready to go.
Okay. And right now, book 1 on Dagger's Wings is currently available, and book 2 is about to come out here in the next couple of days. Can you tell everybody what the name is for book 2 so they can keep an eye out for it?
Book 2 is In Death's Shadow.
Okay. And do you have a schedule for like the rest of the year, or how quick will these books, like book 3, be released after book 2?
I am not sure right now. I believe right now the book 3 is with the editor, and she is going through the book right now. Once she is done and I get some word back, I will know. It's a bit different going through things with a publisher than going independent, because when I was independent, I knew when everything was done. I knew when everything was ready to go. It just depended on, what anything I had to commission, like an editor or like the cover artist, how much time they were going to take. So
what was your inspiration for the series? Where did your idea for it come from? And when did you actually start mapping out what you're going to do for the series?
I actually started creating this series back when I was in junior high.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah, this we're talking back in the 90s. And it was originally, I had originally was working on a fantasy story, and I got more into sci-fi. So I said, okay, I'm going to take this fantasy series and I'm going to turn it into, I'm just going to push it forward 2,000 years. And there it is. It's Nocturnal Nights 2000. It's the 90s. Everything was 2000. So it evolved from there. And as I went through school and I went through college and I went through work, I was like, okay, I kept defining it and redefining it and redeveloping things and sitting there saying, okay, well, the initial concept was this, and it's definitely moved away from that. I wanted to make the science as plausible as possible, make the characters as realistic and believable as possible, really, really infuse realism into it. Because, initially it was a space fantasy. It wasn't really what I would call science fiction or spec fiction. And I drew inspiration from a variety of sources. I was raised on Star Wars and Star Trek and all those series. And I will say that, especially as I really began laying out the series, shows like Babylon 5 were a huge influence, because I really saw how you could make a really long arcing story. And then the various writers that I would read, I was a huge Tim Zahn fan, Stackpole, the Masters, Heinlein, Asimov, and Piers Anthony, that kind of thing. I read everything I could get my hands on. And I really wanted to make sure that when I got this thing ready to go, that I had everything mapped out, I had everything figured out as much as possible, but also leaving myself some wiggle room in case, this happened and this makes more sense to go along this direction. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't spend 7 years writing each book, like certain authors do.
Right. Patrick Rothfuss, we're looking at you.
Yeah, I'm thinking of somebody else, but yeah.
George R.R. Martin also.
Yeah. And you've got fantastic writers that just, they want everything to be so perfect. They take forever, and that's fine. That's their style. But at the same time, you have to keep the readers fed. You have to keep the fans fed. And I'm like, I really wanted to make sure that once I got down into this, said I'm writing this, I'm getting this done, I have a schedule, I'm going to do it, that it didn't take me forever. It's like, if I got everything planned out, I know I can get it done. Then, life gets in the way.
And as you kind of mentioned earlier, and just then, you said that you like to make sure everything that happens in your books seems very realistic. Did writing the books or planning them out back when you did in junior high, did that influence the career that you went into, or is that the career that you've always wanted to go into?
Going into engineering was a career path that I was pretty much always interested into. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to fly or be an astronaut or be involved with planes and spaceships and all that kind of thing. And so I was already pretty much going down that career path when I started coming up with everything. And just, my educational path was... my educational path was based more on making sure that I could go for that career, but also so that the career could help and influence the books and influence everything that I did for the books. Like with designing the ships, I wanted to make sure the ships were as realistic as possible. So I applied knowledge I gained working with airplanes, working in aerospace engineering, when I worked for the Navy, seeing how an actual ship ran, so that had a large part to do with influencing the books and, with delaying their writing and their rewriting and their eventual publication, because I needed to make sure that this was solid before I went in,
Right. So was there anything you wrote when you first started writing the series that once you got further into your career, you were like, that's not really accurate. Let me go back and change that?
Most of the first 3 books.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The books took an interesting process to get where they are now. The first 3 books were originally just supposed to be book 1. So it was a very compressed timeline. It was a very compressed, or not even compressed timeline. The timeline was what the timeline was, but I was compressing all of, these 3-4 years into one book. And it just made the book massive and unwieldy. And I had no idea how real military worked. I had no idea how real ships worked. I was just working off of what I saw on, sci-fi and stuff, and created some stuff that just didn't work. I had at one point all the main characters, they all went to high school together. And I said, well, no, that's dumb. Just all kinds of things. And to the point that I had initially, after I made a very emotional decision based on something that happened in my family life, to publish the book, and it was nowhere near ready. And I pulled it back and completely rewrote it. It was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. Because if I had pressed forward based on that, just no.
You said that you read growing up, and you were raised on Star Wars and Star Trek. So is science fiction something you always gravitated towards? And then, well, yeah, I guess I'll just ask that for now.
I come from a line of engineers. Yes.
Right. Gotcha.
Science fiction is in my lifeblood. And let's face it. Anybody who grew up in the 80s, we were inundated with sci-fi, good and bad. It was in all of our pop culture in some level or another. And it's no wonder that there are so many, science fiction writers and people who are really into sci-fi that came out of that age. And, it's awesome. Mm-hmm. I'm fully convinced that, like my nephew, his generation is going to be much more, and even my kids' students are going to be much more into fantasy, because they've had the Harry Potters and the Tolkiens and Game of Thrones and that kind of thing. That's what's been hitting them more. But also there's still this great amount of sci-fi that's coming at us. So you're getting a lot more of that stuff being accepted in the mainstream. And I just love it, and it's kind of interesting what you said about your kids and that generation. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, it would make sense to see a lot more fantasy in the next, however many 10 years or however, because of Harry Potter and Games of Thrones. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Now, and things like Harry Potter and, even Star Wars to an extent. One of the reasons that I wrote the books the way I am is I really got tired of the trope of the chosen one. You're the chosen one. You're the one who's going to, make all this happen and this, that, the other, just because you're the one, and it's an interesting trope, but at the same time, it's very limiting to character development, because as we see in a lot of those things, these characters just fail up. It's not so much that they're honestly the best of the best. It's the people around them are and keep pushing them up, and I wanted to make sure that when I wrote these, I said, no, these characters, nobody in here is the chosen one. Nobody in here is, if they're the best of the best, it's because they worked at it. It's because they put in the effort and they said, I'm going to be this person. I'm going to be this, ultimate badass warrior. I'm going to be this, world's best pilot. I'm going to, all these things, because I think that as a reader and as somebody who is interested in these things, it's more motivating to sit there and say, this is a person with character flaws. This is a person who is real and who is willing to do the work to become this ultimate person, who's willing to do the work to become this grandiose, awesome soldier, warrior, hero, whatever. It's kind of like, why do people like Batman as opposed to Superman? Batman worked at it. Mm-hmm. Superman just was, or just is, So you got those kind of two different schools of thought on that.
Where did your love for reading come from?
I had a family that loved reading. I had a family that loved stories and storytelling. We would camp out all the time and tell stories. And so I just had a love of stories and of reading. And, I try and instill that in my own boys as well. And I think what really kicked it off was when I was in a first grade, I was reading, what I read is I read a lot of science books. I read a lot of kids science books. And I never touched fiction. I didn't read fiction. I would just watch it. I didn't want anything to do with reading fiction. I'm like, no, I just want to expand my mind. I just want to expand my mind. Mm-hmm. And my mom sat me down and said, no, you're going to read something fiction that's, growing and that kind of thing, to do with characters and that kind of thing. And I'm like, well, what? And she handed me a Hardy Boys book. She's like, read that. And it was the one where they had to fix a ham radio. And they were listening in on the bad guys, and they were able to catch them because of that. And it just really caught me. And I said, okay, this is it. And I ended up reading the entire Hardy Boys series.
Oh, wow.
And all the Encyclopedia Breath. I was super into mysteries at that point. And to the point that I cannot watch or read mysteries now because I figured it out in the first 5 minutes.
That's funny.
It upsets me as people are like, oh, this is a great mystery. You're never going to figure it out. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching the movie and I'm about 10, 15 minutes in. I'm like, okay, I got it.
Right.
And I'm like, hey, I can enjoy it. I'm still enjoying it, but I've got to figure it out. I mean, it's even when I tried reading some modern mysteries, I'm like, okay, these are so, I like finding ones that catch me off guard. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I'm like, I try and instill mystery and secrets into my books. And I'm like, I feel like I'm terrible at it because I know what it is. And as I'm reading it, putting on the reader glasses and reading it, I'm like, I can see it. But I'm like, but is that me seeing it because of, how much mysteries I used to read? Or is it just I let it be that obvious?
Right. Right.
But at the same time, while I install these kind of mysteries in there and I install these questions, I make sure I answer them. Because nothing bugs me more than just, here's this hanging question there. It's like, no. It has to be answered. Unless this is the overarching question of the series, what's the question? Who is Jon Snow's parents? Unless this is a major question that is driving the series, don't just leave it hanging,
Mm-hmm. Since you said that you like your family growing up used to tell stories and y'all would camp and tell stories around the fire, have any of those stories that you were told as a young child, have any of those stories appeared in your books anywhere, or have you tied them into your books anywhere?
Not so much, just because a lot of the stories we told were just kind of family stories or were your typical campfire fare. More so, I think, as we got older, my parents and my dad especially introduced us to more horror elements in stories. And he and I would do the same thing of basically my dad would basically tell us H.P. Lovecraft stories. Mm-hmm. And I started doing that later, too, as I got older. I'm like, okay, hey, there's certain H.P. Lovecraft stories that really work well as campfire stories. And or to scare the pants off of people stories when you take them out of the phone. So it was, I think Lovecraft has actually had a lot of influence on what I've written in terms of that, the whole cosmic horror and just, we are not, one of my favorite quotes when I was younger, when I was really into Lovecraft was, we live on a placid island of ignorance in a vast sea of infinity, and it's not meant that we should travel far. And it just really sets you into this place of this is the universe is vast and infinite, and there's so much more than we can ever really hope to understand, that when we do come upon these things, it's going to just blow your mind. There was another one that was about, when the various sciences finally learn to work together and look at things together, they're going to find out that the universe is a lot, much, much more than they could ever conceive. I don't remember that exact quote, though, but that was one of the ones I used to enjoy as well, and I would have fun with.
Now, you've told us that you're an engineer. That's what you went to school for. Do you find it challenging any in your books to kind of, I don't want to say dumb down, but is it hard for you sometimes to explain any of your technologies or weapons on a level to where an everyday person can understand what you're talking about?
Sometimes, but not as much as I used to, because I really find that enough science fiction and real science has crept into fiction that there's a lot of things like you don't have to explain what a laser is anymore. You don't have to explain what a radar is anymore. You don't have to explain what plasma is as much as you used to. Mm-hmm. You look at some of the older science fiction writers from the 60s and 70s, and they're like getting into the hard science of this is what plasma is, this is how radar works. And, but that stuff is known now. So you don't have to explain it as much. It's when you're doing the stuff that is well beyond that you start running into those issues. And I do it the same way that I describe anything, is that you've got that close over the shoulder perspective. And I have people explain, and even when I have some characters who are, they're brilliant, genius level characters, and they start explaining things at this high level, to have another character sit there and say, dude, we're not that level.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's really helped me in order to get that stuff, not so much to dumb it down, but to get it into a more layman speak, is that I did a lot of that when I worked at Aviation Challenges. I was explaining how airplanes work, how the weapon systems work, how survival works, how all these different things work to a high schooler. And that's still kind of my target. I don't want to say my target audience, but my target reading level. Because if you can explain it to a high schooler, you can explain it to pretty much anybody. Okay. So it's even to the extent of in the first book, I said, look, I definitely have to establish what their FPL is. It's hyperspace. Well, how is my version of hyperspace that I developed with a physicist different than other versions of hyperspace? Mm-hmm. So how do I explain that and not have it be this giant 3-page long dissertation that's going to lose every reader who comes upon it?
Right.
And what I did was, and everybody who's read this passage loves it, one of the characters is working on a ship. He's fixing a motor on a wing pivot for a big bomber. His friend, or one of his squad mates, is sitting there helping him with his homework and says, okay, the next question is explain the nature of hyperspace. And his next response is, WTF? Are you kidding me? This is how much do they want? Do they want the math? Do they want the numbers? What is this? It says, and she looks back and says, it's just explain this. He's like, okay, write it down as I say it. And he just starts explaining it in broad terms enough that anybody reading it can sit there and say, okay, yes, that makes sense, mm-hmm. And it very much goes from there.
Okay.
But I do that with everything, even like with describing an alien. I mean, I love writers like Ben Bova and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He does the Grand Tour series. But they will, as soon as a character walks in, they will describe everything they're wearing in exquisite detail. And it paints this beautiful picture of the person. But you're like, okay, do I really care that they're wearing a gray Armani suit with 1,000 thread count and that their shoes are super polished and, they're wearing these specific shoes and this specific tie and this, that, the other thing? It's like, I more want to know how the character is presenting themselves. And if the clothes are a part of it, then fine, clothes are a part of their character. But to do that with every character is just, I tried that. And I don't work well with it. So instead, what I do is, especially with like aliens, it's okay. Here's this alien that walks in. What's the first thing you notice? Okay, there's what it is. Here's the first thing you notice. They have a giant head and 8 fingers on their hands. Whatever it is. And maybe the color of their skin, or they have 4 arms. And maybe the hands are maybe not the first thing I'll say. It's like, hey, they have a giant head, 4 arms, snake-like body, and green skin. Okay, well, now they reach for something. And now I say they have 8 fingers on each hand. And, how their eyes dilate and how their nostrils, if they have nostrils, flare, and that kind of thing. Because as you build it as you go along, it's more natural. And it's how you notice things. You notice the overarching stuff first. Then as you get closer, you notice the details. Whereas if you start with the details and go out, it's backwards of how you see things in reality,
Okay, that makes sense. With your field of research that you've done, has there been any kind of technology you wanted to include in your book but haven't been able to for whatever reason?
Yeah, sort of. When I originally started writing the books, and it was the Confederation versus the Galactic Federation. My friends at the time were very huge Trekkies, and I was more of a Star Wars nerd, so I would try and make it, I was making fun of Star Trek to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat there and said, well, in the initial books, it was the Confederation had hyperspace, the Galactic Federation had warp drive. And as I really worked on the science of these things, I said the two are mutually exclusive. You can't have one and the other at the same time. The way the physics work doesn't work. If you have a strong universe with a multiverse that allows for hyperspace, you can't have a weak space-time that allows for transport. So I ended up dropping that and going a slightly different direction with that. Mm-hmm. Then, back in the 90s, was a huge thing of, biological ships and, living ships and all this kind of thing. I said, I like that idea. But at the same time, when you really get down into the biology of it, could that really work? And I'm not saying I won't include those kind of things, but it won't be they won't be the super ships that a lot of things make them out. Oh, this is a biological ship. It's the most awesome thing ever. Well, really? Really? Do you really want to think about that and, come back to me?
Right. Well, here at 30-Minute Author Interviews, we like to end each episode on a segment that we call the Legendary Ending. These questions are kind of book related, but kind of not. So the first question is, what songs are currently on your writing playlist?
The Prime Cronus epic music mixes on YouTube. Pretty much anything by Dream Theater. That's really kind of what I listen. Lindsey Sterling, and basically anything I can really write to. Usually not a whole lot of lyrics, music, movie soundtracks, that kind of thing. Things that really put me into the mood.
Do you have a favorite movie soundtrack to listen to? Do you have like a go-to one?
At this point, it's probably the Mass Effect game soundtracks.
Okay. If you were stuck in a zombie apocalypse, which one of your book characters would you want to be stuck with, and why?
Ooh, man, that's a hard one, actually. Because, I've got so many different characters, all of whom would I would want the whole team.
Right.
But if I could only take one character from the team, I would have to say Tade Kudas, who's their instructor in ground combat, because he is just like the ultimate fighting badass, and I could just stand back and let him take care of everything for me.
That works. Now, if you were stuck in a zombie apocalypse, but you could pick any character from any kind of media source, games, movies, television shows, comics, other books, whatever, what character would you want to be stuck with, and then why?
Jean Grey, hot redhead with near infinite psionic powers that could just wipe out all the zombies.
That works. I think that's a first too. I don't think anybody's ever said her. So that is a first here. If you had a time machine, where would you travel and why?
Ooh, time. Where would I go with a time machine? My first instinct would be go to the distant future and come back with some really awesome tech that I could reverse engineer.
Right.
But also, then I'd worry about causality too much to do that, and that's one of my big things with time travel stories, that I can't watch many time travel stories because they mess up causal loops. I don't know. Time travel is such a hard one because it's
so many options.
It's too many options. I'm gonna have to stay with going forward in the future and stealing some awesome tech.
Oh, that works. That works. If you could have one superpower, what would it be and why?
I would love to be able to fly, but at the same time, I know there's a lot of downsides to that. So I will probably go with a techno-telepath, where you can communicate with electronics directly.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, a techno-telepath, because then I could just write all the books without ever having to touch a keyboard, design all my shit without, just while I'm sleeping, write all this stuff down. I could have more time to do my life.
That's funny. That's a good answer.
I'm an engineer. I'm practical.
I like it. It's a good answer. I've never heard that one. So yeah, I like that one. What genres of books do you read when you when you have free time and you read? Do you read the same genre that you write?
I read a lot of science fiction. I also read a lot of fantasy, horror. I look at book recommendations from friends and stuff. Like I said before, I love mysteries, but just too many mysteries nowadays they don't really mystify me as much as they used to.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I love a good techno thriller that keeps you guessing. As cliched as it is, I liked Dan Brown when he was at the height of his writing.
Yes.
And I will say, though, that after I read one book, and when I traveled a lot for work, I read so much that I'm like, okay, all his stuff is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
It's very formulaic.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with being formulaic as long as you change up your formula every once in a while and make it a little different. We used to have a debate of who was better, Stephen King or Dean Koontz. I'm a Dean Koontz guy. And yes, he does to an extent have a formula, but he changes up his formula, and I just enjoy Koontz more as a writer than King because I like his characters more.
Okay. So the question that we're kind of famous for here is, a penguin walks through the door right now wearing a sombrero. What does he say and why is he here?
He's asking me if I've heard the good word of Linux and asking why I choose to use Windows and Android instead.
That works. There we go.
It's a red sombrero, by the way.
Red sombrero. That works. There, yeah. And then before we leave, do you have any advice, whether it be for writing or for life, that you would like to share with the listeners?
There is a quote that comes up a lot in my workout play mix, and I think it's one that applies to everything and everybody, whether they're a writer or whatever their passion is. And basically, it's that talent you have naturally. Skill only comes from hours and hours and hours of beating on your craft. Just because you're talented at something doesn't mean you're the best at it. You have to put in the time. You have to put in the effort. You have to fail, find your problem, figure out where you fail, come back from it and rise up stronger. That's really where it is. You can't just expect everybody to fawn over your first draft, or to think that just because you're good at one thing, you're going to be good at everything, or just because you were good at something before doesn't mean you're going to be good at it forever if you don't keep trying and you don't keep working at it.
Yep, that is very true. Where can our listeners go if they would like to learn more about you or your books?
They can go to spiralwar.com. They can also go to the Space Dock forums and to the Spiral War Facebook page.
Sounds good. Well, we will link all of those in the show notes over at Leigendarium.com. Thank you for taking time out of your day and coming on. We appreciate it.
I thank you very much as well. It was a pleasure to be here.
Well, guys, that's all the time we've got for this episode. Thank you for tuning in to 30-Minute Author Interviews. We hope you tune in every Wednesday for a brand new author interview. And head on over to Leigendarium.com and check out the show notes for this episode. In the show notes, you'll be able to find all the links where you can connect with author S.F. Edwards. And you'll also find links to our two sponsors, Cereal Box and the Galactic Satori Chronicles by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. Go check them out and let them know that you heard about them right here on 30-Minute Author Interviews. You'll also find links to where you can subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. So if you could, please subscribe and also leave a rating and a review. It helps new listeners find us. And we'd also like to thank a few of our Patreon subscribers. We would like to thank Nick Breaker, Diane S. Loftus, Third Scribe, and Maggie Stewart Grant. They are supporting 30-Minute Author Interviews through Patreon. And they're also receiving the very special Patreon-only podcast called 10 Questions With. So visit patreon.com/Leigendarium and find out how you can support 30-Minute Author Interviews as well. Until next time, stay legendary. The Leigendarium 30-Minute Author Interviews. I almost had it in one take.